I'm going to speak, I think, for about 40 minutes. I'll start off reading and then see what happens. From its base in London, the New Zealand Studies Network is aiming to bring New Zealand to the attention of British and Irish, as far as we can, audiences. The reason for doing this is because New Zealand was colonised by the British and Irish, and it inherits many of their ways of life and thinking, including their common law legal systems, their Westminster systems of government, and their religions. So the histories of the British and Irish are continued in the Antipodes, and they display the implications of their ways of life worked out by their peoples in a very different setting, now as Pākehā, sharing a land with a Pacific people, the Maori. This historical continuity is, I think, a brute fact, recognised in academic, professional and political communications among the old settler colonies, even though the obsession in Britain and Ireland with empire and with the British and English domination of others seems for a time to have somewhat dimmed interest in the history of their peoples abroad. And this brute fact will continue to exert its influence, like the air we breathe, even though a declining proportion of New Zealand's literature, film, music and fine arts sets out to make and reflect on these continuing histories. And even though the country's history writing profession, by and large, concerns itself with the country's unique and independent developments and doesn't consider so much its Pākehā roots and the continued history of the British and the Irish as peoples abroad. With John Pocock, another but far greater expatriate New Zealander, we who are launching the New Zealand Studies Network this evening believe there's reason to hope that the current apathy on both sides of the globe is not a sign of moribundity, and that interest in the ongoing history of the lifeways of the peoples of the British and Irish archipelago will, at the last gasp, be revived. Less quixotically, perhaps, and more prosaically, New Zealand should also be of interest to the British and Irish, because all three political and social systems are liberal and democratic, if not, in the English part of the British case, egalitarian. To a greater or lesser extent, and with greater or lesser consistency, they believe that the majority will should constitute and direct government. They believe that democratically elected governments should both abide by and make law. They believe that all individuals should be able to do what they wish under that law. They believe that individual effort, sacrifice and risk should be rewarded, and they believe that individuals should have equal opportunities to hack out a decent life under those conditions. They therefore face similar problems in understanding and dealing with the confusions and injustices they find that such a view of life inevitably brings about. Finally, I think New Zealand's of interest because of the small size of its population compared with the UK's. This small size, 4 million now, compared with Ireland's 4.5 million, gives the country a capacity for rapid political change and is made for simplicity and clarity of a mainly centralised political and bureaucratic organisation. It's a small economy, has one of the most democratic, open and uncorrupt systems of government in the world. Perhaps most attractively of all to the outside inquirer, it's a country in which there's a limited and knowable number of venues for public debate and a limited and knowable cache of official statistical information. All this means that even though it's got no written constitution like Ireland, that it's possible for a student of the country to grasp its workings in a way that's impossible in more complicated political societies, and so it's an ideal ground of study for the economist, the social scientist, the philosopher, the lawyer, the architect, the entrepreneur, and so on. You can grasp it in a way you can't grasp this place. It's for a mix of these kinds of reasons that in the past New Zealand was seen, and not only by Anglophone Europeans, as a social laboratory. It showed how electoral processes and the rights of labour might be reformed without catastrophe, and, in a later generation, how social welfare might be provided the poorest in the community without a country being taken over by a pernicious belief in socialism. And it's for these reasons now the historical continuity of the peoples, the shared liberal democratic mindset, and the small size and openness to any study that I think New Zealand should interest any audience assembled in London in the 21st century. And it's on this kind of basis that the network wants to appeal outside the New Zealand diaspora, which most of the people here are, to the British and the Irish as well. We consider that to be a crucial function of this new society. My talk today is designed to demonstrate this general thesis of why New Zealand should be of interest by presenting in a brutally short form the history of special Maori rights in New Zealand since 1980. I think that the history of what was a huge expansion of these special rights might well suggest a renewed interest in special rights in the British Isles and the Isle of Ireland, Albion and Hibernia, if you like, and suggest also that certain kinds of special rights imply certain kinds of difficulties for the constitutions of what are misleadingly, except in the case of Ireland, called nation states. Such at least are the implications of our shared inheritance that might be drawn on the Atlantic side of our common world. In some ways, the history of the rise of special Maori rights in New Zealand is, so to say, parochial and insular, though it might be better to call it tribal and archipelagic. It's intimately to be known only by those who've lived and suffered through it, and much of the language in which the shift occurred is arcane to all but natives of the place. In 1975, there was the Great Maori Land March, or hikoi, from Te Hapua to Wellington, demanding that no more Maori land be taken, and what had been taken should be restored. A Pākehā backlash ensued. The Waitangi Tribunal was set up to diffuse that situation, together with allied complaints about loss of culture, language, control of the natural environment, and so on. The tribunal was to interpret and apply the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, 1840, and in the light of those principles to recommend to the government how it might address various prejudicial acts it might in future be tempted to carry out at the expense of its Maori people. The tribunal began its work very slowly and very carefully and began to decline into obscurity. In 1981, though, the Springbok Rugby Tour again engaged and divided the country in spectacular confrontation. For a time, opposition to the tour united Maori and Pākehā protesters on grounds of racial equality. Both agreed that there should be no tour while South Africa practiced apartheid, and by implication, while racial discrimination of any kind remained in New Zealand. But during the 1980s, that unity was shattered, as Maori began publicly to proclaim that they were not so much a race or just one of a number of ethnic groups, but were tangata whenua, people of the land, to which I'll come back later. As first occupants, and as spiritually sprung from and at one with the land, they had prior and overriding rights to that land and to mana motahake, a separate and inalienable political sovereignty over and against, if necessary, the colonising Pākehā. Pākehā liberals, like me, were uncomfortable with this. They had no objection to equalising the life chances of individuals through social welfare, and even to equalising the status of multi-cultures in the country on the grounds that all cultures were equally entitled to respect. But they found the discourse of Maori priority more difficult to appreciate. It was one thing to ignore differences in race, even to compensate for racial, as for any other species of systematically distributed disadvantage. It was another thing to privilege one ethnic group above others so that their claims trumped all others. But such objections were to be suppressed, if not overcome, and the incipient development of multiculturalism was halted in its tracks. Though an attempt to write the Treaty of Waitangi into fundamental law failed in 1985, with the attempt to write a Bill of Rights into fundamental law, in that year the Waitangi Tribunal was given additional powers and personnel, and the treaty came to take its place at the centre of a bicultural rather than a monocultural public discourse. Multiculturalism, if it was at all defensible, was, on this ground, to come later. In New Zealand, the emerging story of the 1980s went, there were two peoples, Maori and Tauiwi, that is to say, people from outside. In 1840, representatives of each had signed a treaty which was a foundation document of the political system and of a bicultural society. In the treaty, Maori leaders ceded the general power of governing to Queen Victoria and her nominees, but not their own mana or rangatiratanga, which could be translated as their sacred authority and their chieftainship over their peoples, land, villages, and all things they treasured. In other respects, in signing the treaty, the chiefs and their people took up all the normal rights and duties of equal citizenship that other inhabitants of New Zealand would in time come to enjoy. Seen in this light, in this treaty light, all institutions in New Zealand should be bicultural, so as to reflect this equal division of constitutive authority between the treaty partners, and damage done by past and continuing breaches of the treaty should be repaired and prevented. No current policy could ignore the central fact of the country's founding by two peoples and the authority and mana retained by each of those peoples. No account of its history could present subsequent events as anything other than a narrative of treaty breaches, demonstrated, for instance, in fraudulent land purchases, in war and the confiscation of land, and the continued attempts by governments to individualise and make alienable titles to land which were at once collective and inalienable among the Maori. No account of the legal system could avoid condemning as legally invalid a long period in which the treaty had in fact been scorned or ignored as a source of law. As history and law were transformed, so was moral and political philosophy. Any philosophy of majoritarian democracy or individual rights that ignored inherited group rights was to be dismissed as shallow or as serving the interests of the richer Pākehā majority of the population. Any account of group rights that simply saw groups as vehicles for individual fulfilment missed the point. The group was the unit persisting through time, the individual merely a temporary part. Any account of sovereignty that spoke of the paramountcy of the state, or the crown in New Zealand jargon, either wrongly denied the sovereignty of Maori or the dual sovereignty of the two peoples represented in the treaty. All of these developments, as I said, were in a sense insular and were lived through by the participants in sometimes bitter confrontation, some of the effects of which still linger on in their effects on the living. I can still remember falling out with friends over the issue as to whether Fiji was right to set up a governmental system dominated by a majority of indigenous Fijians. And threats of death or injury, each to each, were not unknown during the 80s and early 90s. On the other hand, close and lasting friendships and alliances were forged in the fire of ideological strife, and what looks to a foreigner like serious confrontation has often been mediated by personal friendship and love, and in general by the face-to-face relationships that are possible in a smaller political society. But for the outsider, what's more interesting is this. New Zealand political thinking and social thinking took on a peculiar cast. Issues of social justice and property distribution, issues of cultural values and integrity, and issues as to the distribution of power, influence and authority among cultures tended to be swallowed up in the language of the treaty. There came to be a consequent reliance on historians and lawyers in discussing these matters because the special rights at issue were a consequence of particular events or situations, of promises, breaches of promise, mutual understandings, and so on. In this intellectual situation, there was a marked deficit of liberal democratic philosophy and of economic socialist-tending discourse aimed at alleviating inequalities between the two main peoples. Pākehā, about 70% of the population, Maori, about 15%. One of the